What basically went down, for anybody out there who hasn't been paying attention for the last 20 years, was in 1996, around about the time that gay marriage advocates began to see some success in states, in Hawaii and Massachusetts, Vermont, some court decisions, some Supreme Court decisions in the states, affirming that same-sex couples are entitled to equality under the law and should be entitled to marry, just as opposite-sex couples are entitled to marry and should be afforded the same rights and responsibilities and protections of marriage. At that time, when we began to see some progress on marriage rights for same-sex couples, Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, signed by then-President Bill Clinton, that really did something unprecedented that the federal government had never done before, instituted a kind of federal definition of marriage. And the Defense of Marriage Act did a couple of things. It told states that they didn't have to recognize marriages performed in other states for same-sex couples, even if they were legal, which has never been the case. In some states, it's illegal for first cousins to marry. In other states, it is legal for first cousins to marry. If first cousins marry in a first cousin marriage equality state and they move to a first cousin marriage discrimination state, their marriage is still legally valid. That one state will recognize the marriages of another state. It's a full faith and credit clause of the Constitution requires that states recognize and honor each other's contracts, compacts, marriages, so that there isn't chaos. But DOMA said that states could have a carve-out on that. It also did something else that was really unprecedented. It said that the federal government would not recognize legal marriages performed in the states if the couple that married was a same-sex couple. The federal government had never done that before, ever. The federal government had left marriage to the states. If the states allowed first cousins to marry, the federal government recognized that marriage. If they didn't allow it, the federal government didn't interfere. This was an unprecedented and unconstitutional carve-out. And people believed for a very long time that if it ever got to the Supreme Court, that they would have to recognize that this was indeed unconstitutional. The Defense of Marriage Act, the Section 3, where the federal government refused to recognize them. And that is what got scrapped. The Defense of Marriage Act in its entirety is not scrapped. Section 2, which allows states to discriminate, to refuse to recognize marriages performed in other states for same-sex couples, that's still in force. There will be more lawsuits. The fight continues. But what it means now, this DOMA decision, what it means now is that in the 13 states where same-sex couples can legally marry, including now California because of the Prop 8 decision that came down the same day as the Supreme Court decision on DOMA, that those marriages performed in those states will be recognized by the federal government. And props, mad props, as the kids were saying 20 years ago, to the Obama administration, which has stated now that your federal rights will move with you, that if you marry in California and you live in Nevada, your federal rights will still be in force. That was up in the air. So tremendous progress. And I was blown away. Where was I? And personally, how did I react? A lot of people have been calling and asking me for my personal reaction. I was in my kitchen at my computer, refreshing my Twitter feed maniacally on that Wednesday morning, waiting for the decision to come through. The last day, what a bunch of fucking theater fags run the Supreme Court. They kept pushing the one decision the whole country was on edge waiting for, kept pushing it back till the very last day. And so we're there, 7 a.m. in Seattle, refresh. Terry's upstairs in bed asleep. Our son is downstairs in his room asleep. And the decision comes through and DOMA is scrapped. Section 3 of DOMA declared unconstitutional. And Terry and I suddenly went, just in a year, from being married only in Canada, boyfriends in America, to being married in Canada and married in Washington State, where we won marriage equality at the ballot box last year, to suddenly, as of 10 a.m. last Wednesday morning, married in the eyes of the federal government. Because Section 3 is dead. We are legally married at every level. And when people talk about marriage rights, and a lot of the sort of first flush sort of conflicts and screaming and yelling have been about florists and bakers. I could give a flying fuck about florists and bakers. But we keep sort of talking about banquet halls and wedding ceremonies and who's going to make the goddamn cake. And there have been bakeries that have discriminated against same-sex couples and literally anti-marriage activists, bigoted anti-gay marriage activists, they were worried in the wake of the decision about florists being coerced into selling their fucking flowers to same-sex couples, which is a whole fucking other issue. And it's a misnomer and it's bullshit. It's a smoke screen. It's a distraction. Florists are required to sell their fucking flowers to same-sex couples, not because marriage is legal, but because in many states, particularly states that also have marriage equality, it is illegal to discriminate against someone in the provision of goods and services based on their sexual orientation. It was illegal in Washington state to refuse to sell fucking flowers to a couple of faggots before marriage was legalized. And it is just as illegal now that marriage is legalized. So whatever, they're worried about florists being coerced. And a lot of gay people are talking about florists and bakeries. But the truth is, as John Corvino points out in his book, Debating Same-Sex Marriage, which he wrote with Maggie Gallagher, is that the really important incidents of marriage, the really important rights, they kick in at the worst times of your life, not the wedding party, not the cake and flowers moment. The really important incidents of marriage tend to kick in hospital wards, in funeral homes, after the death of a spouse. And so, being the morbid motherfucker that I am, what the scrapping of DOMA meant for me personally, the change it's going to make for me, for Terry, for our family, how in the nitty gritty, in the detail. This is what came up for me on Wednesday at 10 a.m. For 15 years, ever since Terry and I became parents, ever since Terry then decided about a year later, or we decided together that he would be the stay-at-home parent, for 15 years, every time I got on an airplane, every time I spoke before a crowd, every time I rode my bike through Seattle, which is a dangerous place to ride a bike, I would think about the plane crashing. I would think about one of the many motherfuckers who are constantly sending me death threats, showing up at an event where I was giving a talk and blowing my brains out. I would think about being hit by a bus and killed on my bike. And, I'm from a morbid family. We have this problem. We call it worst case scenario disorder, where whatever is happening in your life, you have to sort of game out and think about and obsess about how terribly wrong everything could go. And this kind of inoculates you somehow against those potential negative consequences. If you just obsess about it, it won't happen. It's a crazy way to live. But for 15 years, ever since Terry became a stay-at-home parent, I not only had to think about planes crashing, I also had to think about what would happen to Terry and my son, to our son, DJ, after I died. Because Terry isn't a woman, because we are a same-sex couple, because I'm not a woman, he's not a man, he's not a woman, I'm not a man. He wasn't entitled to collect my Social Security survivor benefits, should I die. He would face a crushing tax bill if I died. If he was my wife, he would inherit my property without having to pay taxes. But because he's my husband, he can't. It wasn't just that I would die and Terry would lose his husband and DJ would lose one of his parents, but they would also be impoverished and punished. They would lose the house. They would lose their financial security because I was dead and because we were not married in the eyes of the federal government. And we were told that this was not something the federal government could do, couldn't recognize our marriage, because somehow that would weaken straight marriages. Heterosexual families are only strong because gay families are weak. Only by punishing us, impoverishing Terry and DJ, can Rick Santorum's family thrive. I don't know how that works. I don't know what the alchemy there is, that persecuting a widow, a gay widow, or widower, persecuting that person somehow strengthens straight marriage. Like, straight marriages are vampires that have to suck the blood of pain out of same-sex couples at the worst moments of their lives for their own vitality and strength. It's bullshit, and it's insulting. It's insulting to straight people, but it's really insulting to gay people. And so what happened for me personally on that Wednesday morning when that decision came down was I felt this weight suddenly be lifted from my shoulders that I had been carrying around for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it was like to walk around without that weight on me. But I went upstairs and I crawled into bed with Terry and I told him what had happened. And at that moment, as morbid as it sounds, I thought, I can die now. That if the plane crashes, as the plane crashes, I won't be thinking, fuck, not only am I going to die, but Terry and DJ are now really going to be punished. Terry's going to be punished for having married me. DJ will be punished for the crime of having gay parents. Unfairly punished. Viciously punished. I don't have to worry about that anymore. That has been lifted from me. I don't want anything bad to happen to me. Please don't kill me if you're one of the many people out there who sends me death threats. Please don't kill me. That's not what I'm saying. But now I can die and just be sad about the fact that the plane I'm on is crashing and not also be sad about what is going to be done to my husband and child in the wake of my death. And for that, I am so grateful to Evan Wolfson, who's going to be a guest later on the program today, who is the godfather of the marriage equality movement, to Edie Windsor, who is the kick-ass lesbian widow who brought the suit that toppled DOMA. She was hit with a $360,000 tax bill upon the death of her spouse, Thea, that she would not have had to pay. Little old lady, robbed of all that money she wouldn't have to pay, money that she could have lived on in her old age, taken from her because she loved the wrong person in the eyes of the federal government. And Edie Windsor, thank you. Thank you for kicking the federal government's ass. Thank you for tearing down DOMA. Because in that moment, you made my family more secure. So it was a good day last Wednesday. A good day that came after a bad day. The day before the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. We need to get in the fight on that. North Carolina, Texas, Ohio, we've seen draconian, vicious, brutal, misogynistic, anti-choice legislation fly through those state legislatures signed by their governors. Kasich in Ohio. Appalling. We're going to talk about it later in the show. Appalling. We have to stay in the fight. There are other fights. And the marriage fight isn't over yet. Marriage equality has been won for same-sex couples lucky enough to live in the 13 states where same-sex couples can marry. There are 37 states right now where same-sex couples cannot. The fight ain't over for marriage equality, and the fight ain't over for reproductive freedom, and the fight ain't over. How is this even possible? How can I be saying this in 2013? The fight isn't over to protect the voting rights of African Americans and other minority groups. Fucking appalling. The same Supreme Court. Fucking appalling. We are going to fight for all those things, but we can take a moment to celebrate the victory that last Wednesday represented for justice for same-sex couples. Hard-won, long-fought victory. I was elated. I hope all of you were elated. And I hope all of you are committed to staying in the fight on all fronts.